So sometimes it is good to stop and look back to review where you've been. A good example would be if you're climbing a long hill or climbing a mountain, and those moments when you can turn around and you can see, oh, there's that rock we were by, and there's that stream we were by, and those kinds of things. And so to me, it's felt like it's time to do something like that, if anything, to keep what I believe I've said fresh in my own mind, because I do feel this is building towards something. I don't know exactly what it is yet. So this is an index, a review, a summary of the 12 videos that I've put out so far, beginning with my response to what I thought I saw, what I saw on the floor of Synod, and it's kind of been building from that. And I do have a few in mind to do in the future, so it looks like it's not going to stop anytime soon. So the first video I did, in that one I describe, it's admittedly a simplified categorization, a way of describing the struggles that I saw on the floor of Synod, particularly in 2023 and particularly in the last days. And a struggle, I see the struggle in the wider denomination as well, even as I try to converse with people from various perspectives. And that division is to recognize, we need to understand that division, we need to recognize this, we need to see this. One group of people, the ones who have the agenda in their hands today, is primarily oriented toward process and propositional truth. Simple as that. While another group is oriented towards truth found in relationship and narrative connection, storytelling, the exchange of stories. And so that's an important distinction. I get more and more convinced of it. There's nuances to it, but I get more and more convinced of it. It's almost like a Myers-Briggs thing. It's almost like one of these psychological things where you can say, oh, this is a Sheldon, process and rule and proposition oriented, and this is I'm just thinking of this now, so I don't know who a good example would be of a storyteller. Maybe Mr. Rogers, somebody like that, who's all about the relationship in the neighborhood, right? So those are just two symbolic representations of the types. And this is both shaped by whatever group they're in. It's shaped by their background, but it also shapes how they listen, how they hear, how they interpret everything, but particularly how they then enact the Bible. If you're rule and proposition oriented, you're going to look for rules and propositions and processes to follow. Folks like that love church order, which makes me shiver, right? I don't get that. I value it, but I don't think like that. And it's hard to tell in what order these influences happen and what exactly generates them, but it is a way of viewing the world. It's a worldview represented on the floor of Synod. Synod itself is designed as a legislative process. So it works for them. The floor of Synod works for them. Even from what I can gather, the subcommittees, the preparation committees, don't work quite as well for them as the legislative floor of Synod. And that floor of Synod is not a communal consultation where the talking ends, where at the point where a spiritually discerned consensus is found. It's not that. Maybe the committees are more like that, but I've taken some courses and been part of some what they call reconciliation circles or talking circles, and can see and understand from the history of them that it's a completely different way of thinking, of coming to a communal decision. So that's the first video. It's been the most viewed one to date. So I'm happy about that because it got out there. I want to think out loud in front of the camera and hope that that makes sense to some people. So in the notes for this that I'm building this video from, I have the links to the particular videos as well. If you want to if you hear me say something and you think you want to see that video in particular. The second video I made, which is the second most viewed as well, probably natural following from the first, but there were also times when Paul Vanderklay drew some attention to a video, and I think that gave some of them a bump. In the second video, I issued a call for self-examination by both ends of that spectrum, the so-called affirming and non-affirming of same-sex activity by office bearers. It's very tricky using labels, but that's one way of saying it. So both ends, I say, need to recognize that they may be under secular influences they haven't examined. Secular influences have shaped their thinking more than Scripture or God has. I think that's a high probability on both ends. So I'm, much as I try to make it clear that I have concerns about both ends of the spectrum, it is true, I've discovered making these videos, that I'm more upset with the conservative end than the affirmers. And so I'm going to be honest about that. So you don't need to point that out to me, that I'm being meaner to the traditionalists, the conservatives, or what I call the returnists, which is a label with a bit of a poke to it because it's a response to myself being considered a revisionist. Oh yeah? Well, I'll call you a returnist. I know, it's not healthy at all, but some of these conflicts bring out this stuff in us. I'm working on it. So I think that cultural influence is playing a bigger role in all of this than we are aware, and I leave it to others to identify that kind of thing. Again, there's a link to the second video in my notes, in my blog post notes for this video. In the third video, I try to express how I come to my revisionist relational progressive perspective using two parables that Jesus told. Particularly the one is like it changed my faith journey when I came to understand it this way. And it's part of then another step for me of coming out of a propositional, rule-oriented way, moralistic way of living and looking at Christianity. It was quite an eye-opener. So first, in this video, the third video, I look at the parable of the surprisingly good Samaritan who proves in the end to have the law written on his heart without it being in his head. So he hasn't been part of the propositional piece of this, which would have been astonishing to the people Jesus told the parable to in his time. And this Samaritan feels godlike compassion and acts on it without thinking. Where God-serving men thought of the law and used it as a reason not to act in aid of the victim. And I guess it's somewhat of a legitimate reason, but it's just an important distinction in those two responses. And I also talk about how Jesus builds things in this parable, where the person who asked him the question expects to find himself in the parable and can't really because of how Jesus builds it. He's supposed to show up after the priest and the Levite. And I emphasize that one key learning from the parable is that Jesus is showing how following Jesus is about a way of being, not identifying and completing a list of doings. Remember, it starts, what must I do? And Jesus, the whole rest of it is a contrast to that question. Without giving it a propositional answer, it gives it a narrative answer. Love it. The one who questioned Jesus to get him started telling the parable wanted to help himself by knowing what he needed to do. Jesus, in the narrative parable mode, where everyone hearing expects to find someone representing them in the parable, actually has him in it as the helpless one, dead before the law. And I've come to understand that that is an important faith moment on a person's healthy faith journey, to come to a moment of recognizing how helpless we are before the law which identifies our sinful nature if we care to notice. That's video 3. Video 4, I'd look at the next parable, the one that has been most formative for my faith journey over the past few decades. It is what I consider or refer to in my own head as the prodigal father parable. Prodigal can mean simply lavish or extravagant. I first began seeing deeper relevance and new meaning, revisionist meaning with a dash in it, revisionist meaning, because I saw it in fresh ways that made fresh sense. It began when I read a series of articles in Christianity Today back in 1998 or something, I think it was, by Kenneth Bailey. And so I've provided a link in my blog notes to those articles if you want to read them for yourself. But his main thing is he spent some of his life in the Middle East, and so he knows the Middle Eastern culture quite well. And so he starts to describe how Middle Easterners would have heard this parable and the shock that's built into it, that in North America we don't quite get the sense of in the same way. Now, I am planning to do a more in-depth edition about this parable and its interpretation through Middle Eastern thought and a Christ lens. So I'm going to stop myself at this point, even though I'm excited and I want to tell you lots. That was video 4. And it's to me, it's the pivotal one. I mean, to say it almost in a more drastic way, next to the crucifixion and the resurrection, it's that crucial. It's number 3, you could say. Oh, I'm sure some theologian is going to come to me and say, well, but what about? Right now, that's how I feel. My 5th video, by that point, in my reflection on all of this, I still am, I was getting really upset at the silence out there in our denomination, and upset and disappointed at the silence from the middle. And so I try to issue a bit of a call for the middle to start speaking up. People in the middle who are on the conservative side of the scale should be saying things to the people that are on the extremes of the conservative side, like Steve Zwart did on the floor of Synod when he said, don't be jerks about it. That's the kind of thing. In a similar way, those maybe on the more progressive end, but not quite affirming, need to be calling out some of the affirming people and reminding them of some of our covenant agreements that they have chosen to step out of. Much as we might understand that they felt within their context they needed to do that. That's a piece of the story that it really upsets me when the non-affirmers tell the story of what that church did. It's shorthand. I use shorthand, but it's also somewhat of a representation that does not show much sympathy for the struggle that this church felt itself in. And it's only consistently depicted as a defiant act consciously made to flip a finger at the denomination. From anything I've known, I don't see it that way. And I'm still waiting for the middle to start speaking up. People in forums that I'm on are pointing out that there's very little coming out of the institutions, who you would assume to be fairly middle of the road on some of this issue, but there's no former professors speaking out. There's no current professors speaking out. And yeah, I know that the process and the rule contingent have put a certain kind of fear into the middle, because there are strong implications, not just hints, strong suggestions that an inquisition is coming. But really, will we all just sit back and let this takeover happen? So who's going to speak out? Ooh, I almost called out some names. Should I do that? Neil Plantinga, where are you on this? Professor Cooper, where are you on this? When the Women in Office thing happened, there were some good publications from both groups that helped the people in the middle process the questions. I scared myself doing that. There's others too, maybe Ari later. These are professors that I had in my time at the seminary. We know where at least one of them is. Not the ones I've named, but one who was part of the HSR. So that's the fifth. The sixth is an explanation of what a specialized transitional minister does, because Paul Vanderklay was having a hard time naming the job and describing what it is. So I did a short video kind of playfully on that. And I am, by calling a specialized transitional minister, I'll reiterate here again that I'm not doing these videos as a specialized transitional minister. So in other words, people that experience me as an STM experience something quite different than what I might present in these videos. This is me, Pete, with pastoral experience, speaking what I see, with a sociology background and that kind of thing. By the way, a little plug. I'm in the middle of the video, time for a little plug. I am seeking a contract with a church, and I'm aware that maybe doing these videos might put that at risk, but I think this is important enough that my own personal opinion gets a chance to be shared around, that I'm taking that risk willingly. The seventh video, which ended up being the third most viewed so far, was about punitive church discipline. And it must have connected somehow. Of course, I want to interpret it positively, because it could easily have been handed around as an example of heresy. And so that'll give a video a bump as well in viewership. But my hope, my positive hope, is that it's something that makes sense to people as they share it with others. In that video, I go through a little bit of my own and the history of the CRC in Canada as I've known it, with church discipline of a similar sort that is now being clamored for, now being called for. And I try to point out why that is not our CRC anymore, and why I'm then puzzled that people want to return to that. And I make a slight pointer to switching the language to discipling rather than discipline, particularly because in our culture the church and its leaders don't have the authority they used to anymore. That calls for a cultural adjustment. But anyway, I won't make a whole new video on that. I'll go fairly quickly through the last few. It's all just so that if somebody has come to these later, to my videos, they can look at this one and see if there's any they have any interest in going back to. I did a series of 3 under number 8, that were about systems thinking, because that's one of the tools that we use to understand things in as STMs, but I just find it extremely helpful in all kinds of things, understanding family, for instance. And so I describe a bit what systems thinking is. It's seeing a church group as an organism with multiple layered connections and intelligences. And then I talk a bit about how when there's anxiety in a system like that, things can get derailed unless the leadership knows how to work with and how to be in such anxiety. Then I go to Rene Girard and I talk about systems in relation to mimetics and scapegoating. See, when there's anxiety in the system, any group, then there's a natural, every group seems to do this, there's a seeking for something or someone to blame. And that ends up in scapegoating, which I describe a bit in that video. Very often, of course, in the church, it ends up being the pastor. And so in some ways, there's a part of the role of the pastor that includes accepting that if things go sour and aren't managed well, you will be the scapegoat and you will be sent out of town. I had to come to terms with that in my own situation at a couple of points. And then I speculate a bit in the third one under number 8 on how we've become a culture that has an elevated concern for victims. So this would be now a pushback towards the affirming direction, where we have bought into a cultural pattern where it seems to me, and Rene Girard says things like this as well way back when already, or a couple decades ago, he seems to have seen it coming, where we are the first culture that I know of, I'm no historian, but we're the first culture that I know of where claiming victim status, legitimately or illegitimately, and of course I have pain for those who are doing it legitimately, so I'm not really talking about them, but people in our culture have learned that claiming victim status is an empowering act, is an act that will get you sympathy, that will get you a response from certain kinds of people who feel it's even their Christian obligation to appease those victims. Again, I'm saying it's not quite as serious a victim as a legitimate victim. And so you find, so anyway, I talk about that there. I don't remember exactly what I said, and I'm not going to try and add to it now. Then in number 9, I brought up the question of bounded set, centered set. A question that I think every congregation needs to consider. And that is, and I use the analogy of a farm with fences around it, where the livestock are kept in by a fence. And I ask, is your church like that? Do you have really strong fences that, and even subliminal, like those fences that are hidden under the ground, that will shock people when they walk over them? Those are the ones that have people visit you once and then they never return and you're never really sure why. So do you have strong fences, or are you set up as having Jesus and the gospel message as a well at the center of your being, and you just hope that people or livestock, sheep, figure out where the well is and start being drawn to that well, and it doesn't matter what shape they are in or where they are in their worldview when they come to the well that you have available, a well of spiritual nourishment. That's the fence or the well. It's a favorite of mine. It was when I first learned it was a big change. Number 10 was the finite or infinite game. And so there I ask people to think about, are you playing a finite game which has fixed rules and fixed participants, and a fixed ending where a winner is declared. And there too, some of the language that is used in podcasts by the non-affirmers, again, I want to be careful with my labels, the propositional process people, is the language of victory. So that means that they're playing a finite game, and they know the rules, and there's a day when they're going to say that this is our victory is done, now comply or else. I am not making this up. I haven't collected those examples, but I have been exposed to them on drives when I'm listening to podcasts or by blog posts that I've read. The infinite game is a game that is participated in for the sake of the game itself. And to me, then, it's the gospel game. And it doesn't quite have an end in the same way a finite game does. And in fact, the players change all the time. And we need to flex with those changes as the church. So that's video number 10. And then in number 11, I took an opportunity to share something I think about a lot, and I've tried on a lot of people. I've even used it as an example in sermons, that there's a dangerous aspect to some virtues. And at the end, I just put a question mark behind chastity when it comes to this, but I use humility as the example. And I say humility pursued is already lost. Because the moment you are aiming to be humble all day, at least I found this, I'm measuring with pride how successful I'm being at humility all day. So what's with that? That's number 11. And then in number 12, I talk about you are the sum of your experiences. And again, with all of these, it's just interesting. I haven't quite figured out the whole YouTube comment thing yet. It doesn't appear intuitive to me. And so sometimes all of a sudden something will show up that was commented 2 months before. And I'm not quite sure how to work all this yet. So my apologies if you commented and I didn't even acknowledge that I read it. But there's just I have trouble with that. And it's also a very poor way to have a conversation. So I've told a few people that like to come on there and just make propositional statements about the heresy in my video. This is not the place I'm going to do that. So you are the sum of your experiences means, within the systems thinking idea, that all of the experiences you've had and all the meaning you've made of them, whether that's positive meaning or negative meaning, are residing in you in every moment of every day. And they are, whether you know it or not, shaping how you respond to situations. And so, I don't think I said it in the video, but I invite wondering about some of the drama, some of the trauma, some of the tears and angst that we saw on the floor of Synod. How much of that is then this sum of your experiences thing? So for me, I'll be honest, I'll be personal for a second. My own experience of my father was that he was unable to connect emotionally. He's not alive anymore. And so, and he was a perfect example of a cerebral CRC pastor. Yeah, I'll stop with that there. So I know that sometimes when I'm listening to videos or reading blog posts by people who speak exactly as he did, very close to it, in a way that to me demonstrates they don't understand something, well, they're triggering my dad stuff, is the way people say it today, and so I need to learn about that, and I need to know how to manage that and how to see that when it's happening. And that's what I mean by you're the sum of your experiences. Each of us will have things like that. Some of them are buried very deep, I think, that are creating our responses to the current moment. And so as I look back, as I finally gave up on filling out these notes and said, Pete, it's Tuesday, you need to make the video. Because I can sort of procrastinate by doing that other stuff as well. But of course, I don't want to be rambling like some other video CRC pastors. You know what I mean, right? I'm close to it on this one, aren't I? So looking back at these in the past week or two, I realized that something is being built. I'm building an argument. I'm building a case. I don't know exactly where it's going yet, but I feel it's going somewhere in these videos. And likely when I come to realize what the case that I'm making is, I'll refer back to the videos by number. In video number 4, I said this, and this is what I'm, that sort of thing. Because I find it impossible to make an argument for relational theology and relational interpretation over propositional. I find it impossible to do it briefly. So a major part of the case is that the cultural division between a process and rule-oriented group and a narrative and relational connection-oriented group can be found in many places. It is most certainly evident in some of the challenges Jesus faced from the rulers of the religious system he was born into. And I am deliberately saying that, and I'm deliberately pointing at one end of the spectrum here. His biggest challenges and his harshest words, some of them indirect because they were parables, were for the rulers of the religious system he was born into and their worldview, their view of how they had to defend some feeble God by enforcing the rules. Because they must believe in a feeble God if the God can't do it themselves. So Jesus built it into the parable of the prodigal father, for example, and it's in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Sharing my understanding of these parables is a means of hopefully alerting those who are deeply steeped in process and rule and proposition to see how story or narrative, scriptural narrative that is focused on a relational theme works differently, that you might not have ears to hear. I had a significant chunk of my life that I did not have ears to hear this relational focus, this narrative functioning in a way that breaks open a propositional process rule orientation. And that's one of the things I'm realizing as I try to work out my frustration in trying to communicate, is that I try to think of, okay, so how did it change for me? And it happened by coming across material that some of the courses I took in seminary on narrative, for instance, because Old Testament is pretty narrative focused. I didn't do so well in New Testament stuff because it's more logical. It's affected by its culture, by the Greek culture. So those of us who are in the narrative relational subculture, we do think differently. And that thinking has been shaped by culture, yes, but it's also shaped by a fresh understanding, a revisioning, a reopening of our eyes to some of what Jesus means and some of what the apostles point out Jesus is all about. That is deliberately hidden. Jesus says it himself. It's deliberately hidden because some people aren't ready to see it yet. Oh, that sounded arrogant. Well, those that have ears to hear, let them hear what Jesus is doing and has done in fresh ways. A quick note, I've been trying to stay on a schedule of getting one video out a week. And my aim is to keep up that pace, but I'm not going to bind myself to it. For instance, right now I'm working on one where I'm going to try to play with video clips from another video, and that could take a while. So just so you know, if you made it this far in this one, roughly once a week, but there might be weeks that I don't get one out. So sometimes it is good to look back and see where you've been and make sense of the progress you've made that you might not see in the moment, standing where you are, unless you look back.